This is Dr. Rich Shuttler with lesson number 6, titled Relating to Your Survey Population. This lesson is to help give you a better understanding of how to relate your information about your survey population in your Chapter 3 of your proposal and dissertation. In this lesson, I'll give a brief introduction to this lesson. I'll then address the survey population, giving you some insights and ideas on exactly what types of information you should consider including in your Chapter 3. I'll then address from a quantitative and a qualitative studies perspective on how you might consider relating your survey population. And of course, if you're going to be doing a mixed method study, you might have to add a little bit more information. I'll then go into a few slides, some general information about Chapter 3, more so a reminder to help you keep fresh in your mind as you're writing Chapter 3 some of the most important things to consider. And then I'll conclude this lesson with a reflective summary. As part of the introduction, I want to give you some information about why this lesson is in this program related to your survey population. I have found that with doctorate students, particularly early on, as they're writing Chapter 3, they may not have a full understanding of their survey population. Although you have written about the survey population in Chapter 1, you still may not have all the details you need to be able to produce Chapter 3 in a manner that's going to be approved. What I find often is that the survey population is often confused with perhaps the unit of analysis, or the calculations haven't been calculated yet to decide how many people have to be in that survey population. It's my hope that going through this lesson, I'll be able to give you some insights and ideas that will help either refresh your mind or give you areas where you realize more so that you need to go out and do a little bit more learning on, or ask perhaps better questions of your dissertation committee members and or any research instructors that you have yet in your content courses. I find more times than not, information about the survey population is found within the first 5 pages of Chapter 3. So it's usually early on in the third or the first quarter of the chapter itself. And keep in mind, although you have alluded to the survey population in Chapter 1, perhaps in your purpose statement and or the scope of your study section, those were what I call the abbreviated pieces. Here in Chapter 3, you're going to go into many details, those excruciating details, about exactly who is and who is not in your survey population. You're going to have to explain how you're going to calculate. If you're using a formula, what formula you're going to use. Where'd you get that formula? What proves that that formula or supports that that formula is the correct formula for you to use? If you're going to do a qualitative study and you're going to propose to do 20 interviews, how did you decide who will be in those 20 interviews and perhaps why other people are not? Again, Chapter 1 is like the overview for Chapters 2 and 3 in your proposal. And then you write Chapter 2 much more in depth about their body of knowledge, and you go into Chapter 3 with far more details than you did in Chapter 1 related to your research method and design and everything that's going to happen in that step-by-step method once you're approved to actually start your research. Think about it this way about the survey population. Oftentimes I find that students have questions about who is in the survey population and what is a unit of analysis. I look at it this way, and there may be other ways to look at it, but I look at in the survey population, that's everybody who's eligible. For example, a couple of years ago, I did a survey, and I was doing it of all employees in the United States. That was the survey population. Everybody was eligible if they were an employee. But the unit of analysis are those who are actually involved in the survey, those who are actually qualified to be in the survey based on the criteria that was set, and those people who could actually get the survey. I couldn't reach everybody in the country, but I was able to reach a number of them to be able to find that fair share sample to represent the whole. As you look at perhaps doing a survey of all 8th grade teachers in the state of California, that's fine, but you may not be able to access all the 8th grade teachers in the state of California. So perhaps your unit of analysis are all the 8th grade teachers in one high school, or they are in a certain district perhaps. The more you can learn about the differences between a survey population and a unit of analysis, the better you'll be. You will have to detail this in Chapter 3. If you have some concerns about what these are, please consider now is a good time to write that down on your notepad to learn more about. You could go into Google research, or Google Scholar rather, and look for information about survey population unit of analysis. I'm sure this is addressed in your textbooks. You also have online resources available to you, such as other dissertations that people have done, maybe SAGE research methods online you can look at. But you're going to have a good understanding and be able to support for your dissertation who is your survey population and what is the unit of analysis for those who are involved in your survey population. When you start to think about survey population, think about qualifications. What are the qualifications? Is it 8th grade teachers in California in a district in San Francisco perhaps? Are you doing a case study in a hospital that's a large trauma center, and therefore the qualification of the people who actually work in the trauma center and deal with trauma emergency care situations all the time? One time I did research at a hospital and natal intensive care unit. Only the people who worked in that natal intensive care unit qualified for the survey. While there were other areas such as the emergency room where other people go to adults, there is the emergency room for the natal intensive care unit where children, particularly babies, go to after an emergency once they come in. You have to be able to decide what the qualifications are for who will be involved. In your survey population, as you write Chapter 3, you're going to have to indicate how many people you're going to include in your survey population and the rationale. For example, you may want to do all the 8th grade teachers in the state of California, but you're doing a phenomenological study, so you're only going to do 20 or until data saturation is achieved. There you said how many and the rationale until 20 were achieved in one high school in the state of California, hoping that that would then provide you enough information that you can infer something from to help other people. Again, keep in mind, for Chapter 3, you're going to have to indicate what the qualifications are and how many and the rationale for choosing that. One of the things I like to just remind you of, keep in mind, Chapter 3 should be written to the level of detail that once it's done, somebody else should be able to pick it up, do the research the exact same way you would, knowing why they're doing it, and basically getting the same outcome that you would have had. When you think about the details, that will entail for somebody else who's never talked with you, but just pick up Chapter 3 and go at it, you have to realize that that becomes a certain level of detail, that excruciating details that you need in your Chapter 3. As far as the survey population for a quantitative study, more times than not, people will use a sample size calculation for the convenience sample. This means that perhaps if you wanted to survey all of the employees of a company that's 10,000 people in regards to employment, you're not going to be able to survey everyone, so you're going to do a calculation. And there's a fair share calculator that you can use. And you can go online into Google and just search for it. I'll show you an example how one of my mentees did it in a few minutes later in this lesson, because he did a quantitative study and he used a sample size calculator to come up with a calculation for how many people he needed in his study to be part of that survey population. But in quantitative research studies, you're going to have to support exactly how many are included in that survey population. You may decide, as I did, that everybody will be included, and that's fine too. You just have to give the rationale and the support for that. When I did my dissertation, I had roughly 835 people who qualified for the survey population. I decided to include them all, rather than just do a calculation and use a smaller percentage of the whole, which would still have been valid and good research, but because I could get them all, I sent surveys to each one of them. And this was at a time when they didn't have electronic mail like we have today. Not that I did my dissertation in the Stone Age, but in the late 1990s, that option was not there for me. I didn't work with that company, so what I did is I created 835 surveys on paper. There were 2 pages per survey. and put them into what's known as a company guard mail system so everybody would get that physically, fill it out, and return it. I had one mentee who had over 10,000 employees in the company where he did his research. He wanted to survey all the employees. He was able to do just that. He was able to send his electronic survey to every employee. Now, he could have used a fair share calculator to produce his result to determine how many he actually had to go to make his research valid, but he chose to go to them all. I believe that's what helped to make his dissertation far more substantial and significant than it would have been otherwise, because he was able to get a survey population of over 7,000 people who did a survey. That was much better in some ways to suggest significance and substantial outcomes. If he'd had done the sample size calculation and had far fewer employees, he could have still had and would have had reliable data, but it's just a different level of reliability and validity to his study that he was able to achieve by going to more. I always encourage doctorate students to consider, how can you add more value to your work? If you can reach the entire population, why not? When I did a research study, as I mentioned earlier, of all employees in the United States, I knew I couldn't reach them all. So I had to use the sample size calculator to get that number that would produce that research that was going to be meaningful. Think about the survey population in two ways: the pilot versus the survey population. Now, some people may be doing what's known as a field test instead of a pilot, depending on your research, but more times than not, people tend to call it a pilot, where you actually have a group of people who are going to pilot your survey instrument, particularly if it's in a quantitative study where you're going to take that research tool, that Likert type survey, and you're going to pilot with a certain number of people to make sure that that tool is going to be understood by those that are going to be in your survey population. And you need to indicate how many and who are going to be qualified. Are those people going to have the same qualifications as your survey population? You would address this information in particular in the pilot portion of Chapter 3, but when you talk about the survey population, you're going to reiterate it yet again. That's okay. That's good Chapter 3 development. It's not uncommon that some information is going to be repeated in the areas where it's required to. Then you're going to have your actual survey population, those who are going to get your surveys and complete them or answer the questions for you, and they are the ones that are going to be used in the calculations when you take all your data and compile it to produce information. There's information that you should know about sampling. Are you going to use a probability or convenience sample? If you're not sure what the differences are, perhaps maybe you haven't had those classes yet and you're just moving along in Chapter 3 to get some insights. That's fine. But no, if you don't know what sampling is, you should now go and consider learning more about that, whether you do it in a search online through Google Scholar, or you decide to go into your textbooks, or perhaps go to Sage Research Methods online. You'll have to figure out with your dissertation chair how you apply sampling to your research method and design. It's beyond the scope of this program for me to be able to teach you all about sampling, and whether it be for probability and convenience, because there are so many different dissertations, so many different groups of survey population people to apply it to, that it's beyond the scope of this lesson. But no, when you write Chapter 3, you're going to have to relate to your survey population. Again, the difference between the pilot and the survey, the actual population themselves, as well as sampling, whether you're going to use probability or convenience sampling. In regards to the survey population, for the reader, there should be no doubt of who is and who is not eligible and included in the survey population for your dissertation. This is a common question people get during an oral defense. It's not uncommon that one of your faculty members, your committee members for your dissertation is going to ask you to tell them, not read to them, tell them who was involved in the survey population and how was it decided that they could be, and how was it decided that others could not be. This is a very common question scenario in a dissertation. This is why I have all my mentees in their oral defense when they present their slides, or if you want to call it their information in a briefing to the committee, exactly who was and who was not in the survey population, and give them enough information so that they don't ask questions. But even if you have it and you brief the committee on, you should be ready for a question in regards to your survey population. It's not uncommon that they may try to just make sure you know what you indicated in your research study, and they ask you the question, help them to better understand how some people were not included in your survey population. From a qualitative perspective, your survey population is going to be dependent upon your research design. I'll give you a couple examples of that. Perhaps you're going to do a phenomenological study. There, you're not looking for a large amount of people to be included in your study. In many cases, you will indicate that you're going to interview 20 or maybe 30 people perhaps, or until theoretical or data saturation occurs. Keep in mind that you're doing a doctoral dissertation study. Oftentimes, you can do a study that's not doctoral dissertation worthy by interviewing less people. That could still be good research, but you're doing a doctoral dissertation. Most universities that I have worked with as a committee member or a chair, and those people that have shared insights with me, have experienced that it's not uncommon that universities require 20 or 30 more people to be considered, but include the caveat which says until this data saturation occurs. That tells you, as well as the reader, that if data saturation occurs before 20, that the actual research will stop. If it achieved after 20, then it'll stop then. Data saturation basically means that as you're doing interviews, no new information is being found by doing more interviews, that everything's pretty much the same information over and over, basic same kind of concepts and themes and outcomes. What I tell my dissertation mentees is to do the following. Interview 12 people. After 12 people, put all that data into NVivo software and run the software and identify all the major themes and nodes, all the different categories. Now, if they don't use NVivo, then they have to do it by hand. I did my data analysis from interviews by hand. It's not that hard. It takes a little bit longer. But after 12, I tell my mentees, then go interview 4 more people. After interviewing 4 more people, take that data and add it into the initial 12. When they rerun the data, if no new themes emerge, or no new information, no new topics, then they can stop at number 16 and suggest there that no new data was achieved by adding 4 more people. In most cases, if your research is done well and the study is put together in a manner that's cohesive, chances are if you do 4 more interviews, you're not going to find anything new, or if you did 40 more. At the same token, if running that extra 4 produces a new theme or some new information, then I tell my mentees then to do 4 more. Then the same process occurs. If nothing new, they stop. If more information, something comes out, they do 4 more. Ideally, I believe that if you hit data saturation somewhere between 10 and 13, your study was probably developed too narrow and therefore may not serve the doctoral dissertation to be significant and substantial. Same as if it took you till 35 or 40 to hit saturation. Then perhaps your study again was not designed well enough and it was too broad, and perhaps that made the reason why you had to go well over 20. Now, again, it's beyond the scope for me to teach you all the information. I hope I gave you enough, though, that if you're not sure how to be able to go about learning more, the important point on what should go into your Chapter 3, I believe, if you could do a phenomenological study, is to suggest that you're going to interview 20 to 30 people, whatever you prefer, and include the caveat, or until theoretical or data saturation occurs. If you don't include that caveat, then you may not know if you achieve that in your study. And that would be unfortunate because the whole idea of doing this phenomenological study is to get data that suggests what are the common themes. Now, if you're doing a case study, your survey population is going to be a little bit different because the survey population for a case study would vary from a phenomenological study because the design is different to produce different outcomes. For example, in a case study, you may want to have a number of different stakeholders to give you information about a situation. Whereas in a phenomenological study, it's not about different stakeholders, it's about the same stakeholder, but those stakeholders in that case would be all the same background. I'll give you an example. If you had a large trauma center hospital and it happened to have gone through a major situation where many people were brought in at the middle of the night for a large trauma situation that perhaps happened from an accident. If you're going to do a case study to find out how well those who performed in the trauma center produced their work in a manner to save patients as they were trained, in a case study you might interview several nurses. You might interview several physicians, doctors that were there. Perhaps maybe you're going to interview one or more anesthesiologists. Perhaps you're going to do interviews with some nursing aides or people from the ambulance drivers who brought in the patients. Perhaps you're going to interview a few staff people who had to process the paperwork. Perhaps you're going to interview the main chief nursing officer and perhaps maybe even the CEO of the hospital to gain different insights on how, as a unit, that trauma center performed. You have many different stakeholders. You don't have to interview 20 of each. You may interview, because there were more nurses, maybe 5 nurses, maybe 3 doctors, maybe 1 anesthesiologist, or 2 of them perhaps, maybe 1 ambulance crew, maybe a couple different people who provide support functions. Maybe you also interviewed the 1 CEO and the 1 chief nursing officer, because that's all there are, of 1 of each. And you're getting all these multiple perspectives. Now, if you're going to do a phenomenological study on the same type of situation, perhaps you're only going to interview nurses, and therefore you might interview 20 nurses that were involved in trauma care situations during a period of time. That's the difference in that situation. But for your work, you're going to have to decide, if you're doing a case study, on exactly who should be involved in the interviews, or perhaps observations, or maybe you're even going to do some focus groups. When you talk about the unit of analysis, again, where is the survey population at? If you're going to be in a large hospital in Detroit, Michigan, that's where the survey population is going to be. That unit of analysis is going to be in that hospital in Detroit. Don't forget, you have to make sure that's related to the specific problem and purpose. Your unit of analysis, if your work is aligned well, when you wrote your general and specific problem in Chapter 1, your specific problem should be people who are experiencing the pain also to be in your unit of analysis in your survey population. It wouldn't make any sense to have a survey population in California, but the problem you're relating to is in Detroit. This is where we get to alignment issues. And so it's not uncommon that a faculty member, perhaps a dissertation chair committee member, will look to ensure that your survey population is part of that unit of analysis that's related to the pain that you experienced in the specific problem who you wrote about. For that survey population, in the quantitative aspect, you have that sample size calculator. If you're going to do that, you should have a figure in Chapter 3 that shows the exact figure and cite that figure from what source you've taken it from and explain how you are going to do your calculations. Or you would have already done your calculations in your proposal, and you will have the number there for everybody to read. So you'll provide the calculations, show the formula, show the mathematical calculations, and then explain the rationale for why you did what you did. One of my mentees that you'll see in a few moments, I'll show you exactly how he did his work. You might want to emulate that. And that's what I want to get into now, some of the examples. The examples are all from my prior mentees who went on and graduated. Most were approved on the first pass through their reviews at the proposal and dissertation phases. It's because they did a great job. It's because they paid attention to the details and they went into a level of depth and breadth which allowed for easy approvals. They own their work. They're just letting me use it. I have consent from them to do so. I just basically cut and pasted out of their work with their permission. They own the copyright, and in each case, I'll tell you exactly what their names are, what year they graduated, and the names of their dissertation in case you want to go to ProQuest Dissertations online and download them. The first example I'll give you is from Dr. Patricia Schroeder. In 2013, she graduated and her dissertation was titled A Quantitative Correlation Study of Individualism, Collectivism, and Employee Innovation in Turkey. In regards to her survey population, she has this in her dissertation. The study's sample population consisted of employed Turkish students who were enrolled in either the Karaka Language School or the Turgut Özal University. Study participants were self-reported working for either a public or private organization in Turkey. You can see the qualifications that she's giving you to help you understand who was part of her survey population. She continued on with stratification was also used to ensure that the sample was representative of the 7 regions in Turkey. Now, if you want to find some information about stratification, you would go to Cresswell in 2009 as she did, and you'll find some information there. She continued with her writing, says, the 7 regions within Turkey range in population from 5 million to over 12 million, with a total country population of 70 million in 2009. Now, she takes these statistics, this information, straight from the Turkish Statistical Institute in 2010. Notice the relevancy here, how recent it is. She took her information about from 2009, actually was published in the Turkish Statistical Institute publications just a year later. So it's not like this was 10 years later, 8 years later, 20 years later. Try to keep these types of citations current as much as possible when you're doing your work. She wrote more, indicating that Hofstede, 2008, recommended that sample sizes should be no lower than 20, with ideal samples comprised of 50 respondents. A minimum of 20 respondents from each of the 7 regions for a total of at least 140 survey participants were the goal to provide regional data comparisons. If you want to find more information about sample size, you can go to Hofstede's work if you care to. Now, Dr. Joseph Hagee, in his 2013 award-winning dissertation titled Influence of Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, a Quantitative Correlation Study, provided this information. This study utilized a probability sample random sampling techniques for the initial calculations of data to ensure that Christians and Muslims in the population were fairly represented in the sample. If you want to find out more information about utilize the difference, the probability simple random size calculation techniques, you can go to Salkin and find that for yourselves. The following formula was used to determine the appropriate sample size representing the given population. And you'll see the citation here. Now here you actually see the formula itself. Notice how in Chapter 3 he indicated that he used the formula, the calculations. He said where it was from. He actually included it here as a figure. And if you see a little bit lower, where you see near the bottom of the screen, he puts his numbers in there to show you exactly how he calculated the 95% confidence level rate to the numbers that he needed. Now on this page here, this is just following on from the page from the information before. I just made this larger than it is on the page that you might read if you had it printed or had it in a PDF. And he goes on to indicate the actual calculations and how he came up with the number, how he rounded it up. And then he goes in to say how he did comparison sample size formula for the CAC or data. Here's the formula again, and he provides his information how it came to be. Now in the narrative, he wrote the sample size was rounded down from 384.16 to 384. That makes sense, right? Because you round down. Because the computed recommendation sample size does not exceed 5% of the population, there was no need to use a Cochrane's correction formula to recalculate the sample size. And you can find information about Cochrane's correction formula in Bartlett 2001. An additional number was added to the sample size to allow for exclusions resulting from the lie scale and dropouts from the survey taking process. It's not enough that he just put that extra person in, the extra number, but he explained why. Now, Dr. Susan Krysteniak in 2011, in her qualitative study, which is titled Exploring the Experiences of Complementary Therapy Nurses, a qualitative phenomenological study, explained her survey population as such. A convenience sample of 30 nurses was proposed for the completion of the research study, and the actual number of participants was determined when the theoretical saturation of themes occurred. Now, oftentimes students will say that they are going to propose 20 or 30. She proposed 30. And remember, this is a dissertation that you're looking at, the information here, so she's talking in the past tense, but she indicated it was proposed to do 30. Convenience sampling, referred to as voluntary sampling, is used in qualitative research when participants are needed to come forward for the research study. And then she highlights, or cites, if you will, Pollock and Bett 2006. You can get information there about convenience sampling if you need yet more information to help you develop your background on convenience sampling. This, again, is a good reason why going to other dissertations that are recently published from your university, in particular with your same research method and design, if you start reading other research reports and studies, you start to find a host of references that perhaps you didn't know even existed. In Dr. Krysteniak's work, she continued on in her chapter 3 of her dissertation with, for this study, letters were mailed to 30 nurses who had completed the integrative educational program and were participating complementary modalities. See Appendix E and F for more such information on that information. The recipients voluntarily responded for inclusion into the pilot test or research study. Now, just to kind of conclude this, is to help you keep in mind that your Chapter 3 reflects critical thinking skills, your critical thinking skills. It shows your discerning knowledge of research. When you can start to suggest how your survey population was decided, who can be in it, who's not in it, what the rationale is, how you calculate that survey population. Once you give all that information to help somebody else understand the level of depth and breadth of your knowledge of your research method and design and how it's applied to the study you're actually going to do, is just that. It reflects your discerning knowledge of research. It also helps the reader and you to realize that you are a subject matter expert. You are expert in your research method and design, that at least how it's applied to your study, you have all the knowledge that's necessary to be able to make your study happen. And when you write it as such, where somebody else could pick up your Chapter 3 and actually do that research in the same manner that you would have done, knowing exactly why they're doing each step, then you know you have a dissertation, Chapter 3, that's developed extremely well. The end result, of course, for Chapter 3, as somebody reads it, it helps to inform others of your choices and the rationale for your choices. Keep in mind, in Chapter 3, have you explained what you're going to do? Have you explained the steps of how you're going to do it? Have you explained the rationale for what you're going to do and how you're going to do it? If you can answer yes to all those questions, then I encourage you to take that chapter and give it to somebody else who has the same general background that you have, and give it to them and ask them, if you had this to do, would you be able to do it knowing exactly why you have to do everything that's prescribed in the chapter? If they say no, I would suggest you go back and do some more work and make it even more specific and succinct, perhaps more purposeful in design. If they say yes, then you can be rest assured it's ready for your committee members. What kind of details are we talking about, Chapter 3? Yep, it's those excruciating details. Just keep it in mind from the very beginning that you're going to have to write with details. And if you're not a detailed person, you're going to have to figure this out. Doesn't mean you have to live with details your whole life and be observant of them all, but it does mean that as you're writing your proposal and your dissertation, you have to be detailed in everything you're going to do. It's not just enough to say that you're going to do 20 or until data saturation is achieved. You have to help people understand why you're doing that, why you're going to stop at 20, why you're going to continue on if you don't hit theoretical saturation. Continue to add details and you'll do better and your work will get approved sooner. As part of the reflective summary, I gave you some introduction information, just basically why this lesson is, to help you understand perhaps better, or just to give you some insights that I have that I use with my mentees about how to allude to the survey population in Chapter 3 and what kind of information you have to have. In regards to your survey population, whether you're doing a quantitative or qualitative or mixed method study, your dissertation chair will guide you on this, but you're going to have to know exactly who is in your survey population and who is not, and you're going to have to write to that in Chapter 3 to those excruciating details. This is not really hard work once you learn it. So I encourage you to go through your Chapter 3, much like I've been encouraging in other chapters, one section at a time. Once you develop and you truly understand who your survey population is, you'll write it and you'll be done with it. You may have to allude to it again a couple other times, perhaps in Chapter 5 again, once you do your dissertation, but that's okay. You'll be able to answer the question whether somebody asks you in just a regular casual conversation or whether you're in an oral defense on exactly who was and who was not qualified to be in your survey population. Then I just concluded with a little bit more reminder of the value of your work and how to really build a significant, substantial dissertation. Keep in mind that as you write Chapter 3, it's got to be from that research perspective. It's got to be in a research context. Use the words that are appropriate for the research terminology, such as survey population, unit of analysis, theoretical or data saturation. The right terminology applied will help to show your expertise in your research method and design. Again, I'm Dr. Rich Shuttler with the program Taking the B Out of ABD. I do believe that education is a lot like life. The more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. And as I always say, the same holds true with your dissertation. The more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. And the more details you put into your work, the more you're going to learn, and definitely the more you're going to get out of it. I wish you continued great success developing your proposal and dissertation. If I can ever help you, don't hesitate to email me. You can always look at the Facebook group called Taking the B Out of ABD. And if you're not enrolled in the weekly webinar series, you're welcome to do that as well.